Marijuana. President Clinton smoked it but didn't inhale. Tory leadership candidates Kim Campbell and Jean Charest have both smoked it but did inhale. It said everyone who grew up during the 60s and the 70s has probably smoked pot at one time or another. I'm Phyllis Bennett, and the question is, should marijuana be decriminalized? My guests are Superintendent Jim Beaumain from the London Police Force. Superintendent, you're going to say no, it should not be decriminalized.
I will say no, it should not be, because in my opinion, it is a gateway drug to harder narcotics. And at this particular time, or any time, this is the wrong message to be sending out to society, in particular youth.
And Robert Metz from the Freedom Party of Ontario. Mr. Metz, what's your position?
Well, I think the evidence is in, Phyllis, that cannabis prohibition simply doesn't work. It's counterproductive. I think what we need are not laws prohibiting the use of substances, but laws that simply hold individuals responsible for their own actions in society.
And Jeff Shurey, who is with Hemp, and Hemp would like to see it decriminalized.
Yes, we at Hemp Canada feel that the war on drugs, which has primarily been a war on marijuana, has been a costly and dismal failure, and it's time that the archaic and outdated laws be changed.
Is it time to decriminalize marijuana? More when inquiry continues. Begin by asking, what is the penalty if you're convicted of simple possession of marijuana?
The average penalty rate at the time is probably about $100 a fine. For simple possession, we do not arrest people anymore. They're generally given a promise to appear, or an appearance notice right on the street, similar to a traffic ticket that brings them in front of a court.
But they do, it is a criminal offense.
It is a criminal
record
offense.
After
That is correct. You will have a criminal record if you're convicted of possession of marijuana.
Mr. Shurey, you think that's too heavy-handed, do you?
Well, I think what Superintendent Beaumain has failed to mention is that the maximum penalties under the law are far greater than the $100 to $200 fine that's normally handed out.
But maximums are very seldom handed out.
Yes, but they are on the books, and they're open to be used on the discretion of any judge at any time that may feel that by using these particular measures, he may bring a hammer down and make an example of somebody. Take my case, for instance. Although I received a $2,000 fine for cultivation of marijuana, the maximum penalties under the law for that were 7 years imprisonment and up to $20,000 a fine. Certainly, when you're negotiating your case, your lawyer and the prosecution, knowing that this type of heavy-handed approach could come down upon you if you decided to fight your case in court, is a restriction. Anybody who would want to stand up in court and speak freely.
When you were convicted for cultivation, you were a teacher at that point?
Yes, that's right. I taught at Hillcrest Public School here in town.
And you lost your job as a result of that conviction?
Yes, that's right. The school board felt that I was no longer a suitable role model for the children of London. They had no arguments with my teaching record, my abilities, or the effort that I put into my job. And certainly the question that I would like to have answered is how is it that I'm no longer a suitable role model as a teacher for the children of this city, yet either Kim Campbell or Jean Charest, one of which will be the next Prime Minister of this country, after having admitted to basically no more serious offense than I committed, there's been no outcry, and one of these people will be the role model for the entire country.
Mr. Metz, you don't think there should be any regulations whatsoever?
Well, no, I do believe in regulations, but not in the sense of prohibition. I think prohibition type of laws are misaddressing the issue. Drug use and abuse are legitimate health concerns and legitimate education concerns when you're talking about prevention. But you can't use the law as a preventative instrument. The law is a recursive instrument. We have to remember that the average person...
What's a recursive instrument? Maybe you
well,
could
for
define
example, we don't call the police until a robbery's taken place. I mean, we like to talk about the idea that the police can, quote, protect us. But really what the law is there to do, and what it effectively does, is offer recourse to people whose rights have already been violated. So in that sense, in practice, the law is really a recursive instrument. And what we're trying to do is, on the one hand, supposedly educate people about the disadvantages and dangers of using drugs, or on the other hand, we're saying, well, it doesn't matter what we tell you, we're not going to let you use those drugs in the first place. So on one hand, we see an appeal to reason. On the other hand, the bottom line message is, you do as we say, or else we'll treat you as a criminal. I don't think drug use in any way, shape, or form, when it's treated as a crime, in any way helps the drug problem.
What about that, Superintendent Balmain? I know this is sort of a sociological question here, but would better education solve our problem?
Obviously, better education directed at the proper audience would alleviate the problem to some degree. The law is there to a great degree as a deterrent if we're speaking about marijuana users. They generally fall into three categories, the way I've seen it. The people in society that would never use illegal narcotics for any reason. The people who sit in the fence, when I'm talking about marijuana use here now, which is considered a soft drug, they're sitting on the fence, don't know which way to go. And those that will use that particular drug, no matter whether it's illegal or not. The people that we aim to deter at, or I hope the law deters, are the people sitting on the fence. And the fact that they do get a criminal record deters many, many young people from actually smoking marijuana, in my opinion. I've been on the streets, specifically London, 27 years, and I've always seen marijuana as a gateway drug. Any of the kids or any of the people I've talked to later on who are into harder drugs, such as heroin, cocaine, or some of the other mind drugs like LSD, always started off with marijuana. And I think to decriminalize it is definitely the wrong message to send to our youth.
Mr. Shuri, do you think it leads to harder drugs?
Well, I've got a few problems with that. The Addiction Research Foundation of Ontario was unable to send a representative here today. They're not even willing to back up the gateway theory as far as marijuana is concerned.
But they do favor not decriminalizing.
Right, absolutely. The Addiction Research Foundation is in favor of maintaining the legal constraints on marijuana. However, they are not willing to state that marijuana is a gateway drug. The reason being the statistical evidence. The primary drugs of choice for the first-time user are alcohol and tobacco, which I know many people may step back, but these are drugs. They affect the mind, they affect the body, and in fact, the statistics show that 96% of all marijuana smokers never try heroin or never go on to onto harder drugs at all. Again, these are statistics from the Addiction Research Foundation, so the numbers aren't there.
But do we know whether the harder drug people, the ones who are using heroin and crack, started with marijuana? Have they done that kind of a research?
No, the statistics show that primarily the first drug is either alcohol or tobacco. So if we're going to establish a gateway theory at all, which means the drug that leads you into the drug-taking syndrome, if you will, and carries on to harder drugs, it has to be alcohol or tobacco. They're the first drugs used.
Mr. Metz, what do you think about all this?
Well, again, I think this all sounds well and fine on the surface, but we can easily see the result that we want to achieve by a certain law. But what we never see and don't talk about enough is all the other side results that are created by a law. It's nice to say that you're going to target those people sitting on a fence, but in targeting them, you're hitting everybody in the whole country with one broad law. And I don't think it would treat, why are we treating two of the most harmful drugs in society legally,
tobacco and alcohol,
cigarettes and alcohol, and yet we take one of the most benign drugs in society and treat it as though it were one of the strongest drugs.
Well, do we know that it's benign?
Well, certainly the evidence, I always read the reports about the use of marijuana, and it always seems that as an underground market, it is like number 2 or 3 in our overall trade, rivaling the #1 industries in our country. So obviously the use of this drug is absolutely predominant. We see a recent statistical poll that was just recently released showing that, how many was it, Jeff? How many people on the poll actually said that they were at one time smoked or do smoke marijuana? I mean, the numbers of people, if we were going to be consistent on this law, we'd have to lock up half the country. And that's just not reasonable.
In that survey that you're talking about, when they asked those same number of people, should marijuana be decriminalized, 70% of them said no, it shouldn't be.
Well, that can't be the Addiction Research Foundation report that came out last week.
I did read that
statistic. Because it said 53% were in favor of decriminalization or legalization, and only 47% were in favor of maintaining criminal laws against marijuana. 53% is a majority of the people in Ontario. In fact, our own Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, was elected with far less than 53% of the popular vote.
I think you can throw studies around depending on how they're worded, and you can get almost any result that you like. But I think the bottom line is that if tobacco were to come onto the market today, we would be standing here arguing probably the same about tobacco use. The fact that it came in where there was not the medical research to tell you the damage
And the same
of
argument
tobacco.
holds true for aspirin, as we've been told already.
Well,
But, you know, I think the tragedy of drug law enforcement is that what you end up being, we as taxpayers are paying you as the police to effectively uphold what I think is a drug monopoly. You're making it attractive through drug enforcement for people to get into a field. I mean, marijuana should have no market value practically. It's a weed. And yet, when you create a prohibition climate, you make this weed so valuable that all kinds of people get interested in it who wouldn't be interested in it in the first place. And there you start the chain, a self-perpetuating chain of drug creation, drug enforcement, more drug creation, higher penalties. The higher the penalties, the more attractive it gets.
I know you're going to want to respond to that, Superintendent, but we're going to take a break first. We'll be right back. Superintendent, are you creating a drug monopoly? Are you feeding money into organized crime by making sure that marijuana is not decriminalized?
no, I don't see it that way at all. There have been several attempted efforts, for want of a better word, to legalize drugs. One in Britain, where they went through the heroin thing. That was an absolute disaster. That increased the addicts like multiple times. They finally closed it down, and as a result of that one experiment, just in the county of Cork alone, there are 10,000 heroin addicts that started in because of the British thing. The other recent one was the one in Switzerland that they just closed down in 1992. The social problems, the crime, and everything associated with it were just horrendous, and they finally closed that one down too. The answer, in my opinion, is not to legalize any of the narcotics. That's the last thing you want to do.
Even if you licensed growers, say, if you sold it under restricted premises like beer stores or the LCBO, I mean, you would...
Well, that would be a governmental problem if, obviously, if the legislature said they would decriminalize it and decide to sell it. Of course, that takes it right out of the hands of law enforcement, and that would be up to them how they would do that. That creates a whole, maybe another whole other inquiry program. It's just as who they would sell it to and under what conditions.
Yeah, I've got a problem with what Superintendent Balmain has said here. First off, he's talking about heroin, and we can't possibly, under any stretch of the imagination, compare marijuana with heroin. The only similarities they have is that they're both illegal, and somebody in possession or trafficking either one of these drugs would be subjected to the same penalties under the law. That's where the similarities end. Marijuana is one of the most benign substances known to man. Its toxicity level is so low as to be less than what our drinking water.
How do you know that?
Well, I know that from figures from the Addiction Research Foundation that tell me that over 20% of all deaths in Canada are related to tobacco, over 10% of all deaths in Canada are related to alcohol, and less than 0.2% of all deaths in Canada can be related to all illegal drugs, and StatsCan says nobody died from marijuana, not just last year, but ever.
But, I mean, that may be just the fact that, you know, an awful lot more people smoke cigarettes and an awful lot more people drink alcohol.
Well, we have figures from StatsCan as low as 3 million Canadians are regular marijuana users to figures as high as 8 million. There's certainly a significant sample out there in Canada that not only use marijuana regularly now, but have been, like myself, for over 20 years. I'd like to know where all the deaths are, where are all these health tragedies that we've been told by organizations like the Addiction Research Foundation in their book here, Marijuana Answers for Young People and Adults. They list all sorts of scary possibilities.
But I don't think the Addiction Research Foundation, and I'm sorry that we couldn't have a representative here, they're not saying legalize it.
No, they're quite against it, obviously. If you read through this book, they've made all kinds of claims as to the hazards of marijuana. The problem I have and have had for 8 months is nowhere in this booklet do they list what research they're basing their claims on. We've attempted for the last 8 months at Hemp Canada to contact the Addiction Research Foundation locally and through their president, Mark Taylor, in Toronto. We've requested a list of the research documents to back up their claims, and they've not answered our letters. They haven't returned our phone calls. They refuse to tell us what research it's based on. Now, we have all kinds of research at Hemp Canada that refute at least 15 of the claims that they make in here as to the hazards of marijuana. To go on, we've got a book that my son came home with from school this year and was asked to read at home. And the paragraph or the article in here about marijuana makes, again, all similar claims to what the Addiction Research Foundation is saying. And here they list two of their studies, one by Dr. Jakubowicz done out in Simon Fraser. This man has been cut off from funding for marijuana studies because when he was questioned by a panel about his research, he couldn't satisfactorily answer their questions that he had done legitimate scientific research, and he's no longer funded for marijuana research. They have a Dr. Heath listed in here in his study that shows that marijuana kills brain cells. What they fail to mention is that Dr. Heath himself stood up and renounced his own work under pressure after found out that what he was doing was taking gas masks, strapping them on monkeys, and pumping the equivalent of 50 joints worth of smoke through the gas mask in 5 minutes. The researchers that looked at his research determined that the brain cells have been killed by asphyxiation from lack of oxygen for 5 minutes a day by these monkeys. Yet this is still published and given to our children as fact when the researcher himself has renounced his own work.
I'm going to let Mr. Metz jump in here.
Well, it's been curious, too, that the Addiction Research Foundation is always so elusive when it comes to defending their position. My observation has been that the Addiction Research Foundation is a, quote, privately funded group to support government results before the results are even in. I mean, they're paid to tell us what we're supposed to hear.
Well, maybe we should get back to decriminalizing marijuana.
Well, you know, this is all part of it. When misinformation and disinformation is being used to justify laws, you have to suspect that something is wrong with that law. And again, it comes back to the issue of what are we trying to do with our drug laws? Are we trying to decrease the use of drugs? Because if that's the case, we don't need drug laws. The facts are in, overall use of drugs is declining, both in legal drugs and in illegal drugs. Even President Bush said this when he launched his famous, war on drugs again. He began with the preamble that while all, major drug use is down, the war is not over yet. And then he called for more resources to be pumped into this war. Education is winning the battle in the long run. And I think, I've read studies as well that one difference between legal drugs and illegal drugs is that the illegal drugs get stronger and more dangerous. Each time one drug is made illegal, a stronger drug comes along. In the legal drug field, you see a move the other way. More people are quitting smoking. You see low-tar cigarettes, wine coolers, light beers, even zero-alcohol beer. Who would have ever heard of such a thing before? And that's been the trend anywhere that laws like this occur. And I'd also like to say something about the statements made about the studies in Europe and in Britain. Certainly what was said here earlier was totally contrary to what I've just read and what I've just seen. 60 Minutes just a few weeks ago called it a resounding success, getting rid of Prohibition in Britain and letting addicts fund their own addiction, but under government supervision and control. It was a resounding success from everything I've seen. So clearly, the statistics that each side is using are going to always be geared to their arguments. So fundamentally, I think the issue here is, what right does the law have to tell an individual in the privacy of his own home what he can do with his own life and body? That's the fundamental issue here. And we're not talking about children. Children are a separate issue.
Well, the law translates into the legislatures and our own governments that we elect. And whether they're deciding that we'll wear seat belts because it saves us money down the road and injuries in traffic accidents, or we won't smoke marijuana because the active ingredient in marijuana is tetrahydrocannabinol, and that's a mind-bending drug. It's a hallucinogenic type drug. And back in the 60s and 70s, most marijuana was about 1%, 1.5 THC. Now, homegrown here in the city is 15%. What they call the so-called real good stuff from Mexico is up as high as 25 to 30%, and that is very powerful narcotic.
Well, that precisely coincides with what I just said. The drug is illegal and it's getting stronger. But the issue again is you can't compare seat belts to smoking marijuana.
No, I compare it to when you said why make a law that...
You can make a law, and I would support a law that you can't smoke marijuana or drink alcohol or do any drugs on the streets or in public. We're not talking about public property under any circumstance. That's where your jurisdiction, I agree with, should be enforced. But I think that the police themselves are losing a lot of respect, and that citizens start to disrespect the law because of drug laws. When you're treated the same as a criminal, or viewed by society the same as a criminal, for doing something that you regard as totally harmless to anyone else. And this is the issue we're not dealing with, is that a lot of people out there may hear all this evidence, but they disagree with it.
But should individuals be allowed to decide whether or not an act is illegal?
Well, we do collectively through our governments, and that's why we're debating an issue like this publicly now. I mean, that's the function of a democracy, that's the function of our court system. I mean, I'm not saying that we should all go out and be civilly disobedient.
We're not debating should or should not we introduce a new law. There is already a law in the book saying that this is a criminal offense. And personally, if I know that's a criminal offense and I take it upon myself to smoke marijuana, I will not come crying because I now have a criminal record, like, oh, this is terrible, like, I didn't know this, and this has affected my life. Like, the law is on the books, has been for years and years.
It's not going to affect Kim Campbell's life or Jean Charest's life, and we have videotape confession to a crime.
I don't want to get into politics and what politicians do to make themselves sound earthly.
And I have a law that I can't break, and that's that we have to take a break right now. We'll be right back.
Right. I mean, aside from the fact that Kim Campbell and Jean Charest have broken the law and admitted to it, you know, the law has not worked. When cannabis was made illegal in this country, it was 9 years before the first person was busted with a cannabis possession. So it would seem that when the law came into effect, there must have been very little cannabis use in this country, because now up to 20,000 people a year are receiving permanent criminal convictions for cannabis use. The other thing is that, you know, although there's an interesting argument about legalization, the bottom line is sooner or later cannabis will be legal in this country. It has been legalized in France, Spain, and England as an agricultural crop in order to produce pulp for paper and fiber for textiles. In fact, Italy is recently...
But is it legal to smoke it?
In Italy, they've recently decriminalized cannabis possession for recreational use. They did the same thing years ago in Amsterdam, not over the entire Netherlands, but in Amsterdam. And the interesting statistic that's come out of Amsterdam, and this is what precipitated Italy to go ahead and decriminalize possession, is that when they decriminalized in city limits in Amsterdam, not only did the use of crack, heroin, cocaine go down, but also so did the use of alcohol and tobacco. And certainly, I know that Superintendent Balmain would be the first to agree that alcohol produces a far more violent crime in this country than cannabis ever could. Would you agree with that, sir?
Not necessarily. Alcohol abuse or any substance abuse will obviously encourage mood changes. But if I go for dinner and I have a beer, I don't have a beer to get smashed out my skull. If I sit down and smoke a joint, I do it for one reason, and that's to get wasted.
Well, excuse me, sir, but have you ever smoked marijuana?
No, I haven't.
You haven't? Okay. Then I've got a couple questions for you.
Well, we'll take one, and then I've got to let Mr. Metz in.
Okay, all right. How would it have affected your career, sir, if you had filled out on your application to the police force that you had smoked marijuana in the past? Do you think that you could have been as successful in your career or even had a career in policing if you had written that on your job application?
I think possibly after inquiry, maybe you should phone our personnel department, find out how many kids coming on today are asked that question, how many responded positive and actually are working on the police department.
So you do ask the question then?
It's asked.
And it doesn't deter your career?
Not necessarily,
How about if you were found to have lied about that question on your application? Do you think that might have
we're getting into the whole
right.
lying.
I'm going to let Mr. Metz in here. We're quickly running out of time.
Again, I think that prohibition is not the answer. I think the way to reduce drugs overall is through education and encouragement, and that certainly treating people like criminals for things that they themselves do not regard as being wrong. This is the key issue here. I think a lot of people recognize that certain things are illegal that just don't harm other people. Sunday shopping was a classic example. I mean, we'd easily argue that if Sunday shopping were against the law, we could go into people's...
Inquiry, bringing people and issues together. Join us again next week.